In this video, we're going to go over navigating the menu structure and accessing the different menus and their passcodes. There are a few that you would need to access as a vendor to be able to update settings and change settings, whether it's the scale and changing it from 2 digits to 3 digits, whether or not the customer would provide that, the way the tare functions, the way that buttons press, the way that the screen potentially looks, and things like that. So first we have to access the maintenance screen. To do so, normally on the second function setup, we click and slide. We have the secondary keys, which is usually for the manager or the engineer, us who uh, set up the scales. Will have the maintenance button. In this maintenance button, this is where you would click and get to the maintenance screen. This maintenance screen provides three options. So you have three options: menu, reboot, and turn off. Of course, these are self-explanatory, and we're going to access the menu. Inside the menu, you now have these options to go into. Closing report, training mode, you'll never access. Those are for this this scale to be a register. And we do not set these up as registers to take cards and cash and things like that. You have registration mode, which is the operator most important screen. It's basically the screen where you're going to do all of your operations at. So inside here you have programming, maintenance, and report. These are the three that you're going to be accessing. Report not as much. This is where you can get information off of the scale, PLUs that have been printed, weight volumes, things like that, that the customer might use, might not use, but you can also gather that information in the RSM program. It all depends on the customer needs and what we're able to provide them. If you open up the report menu, you'll see the different options that are going to be available that you have. A lot of these I haven't been into myself. Primarily I'm in the PLU report, where we can list the PLUs that you want information on, and you can preview them and it'll tell you what will print out. On the linerless scales, these will print off well. On the non-linerless ones, you have to have an external printer to get it to print all the information that you need. From here, there are times where I have done PLU price change, to where you can check out the PLU price changes that have been done, if at all. At this point, there's nothing here to be listed. It's also a setting and user setup that you have to change so that it will log these price changes as well. Otherwise, it doesn't store them and doesn't fill up the memory of the scale. Outside of that, there's not much here unless you have clerks information and things like that that you can access. You can go into these and navigate them yourself and find if there's anything that's useful, and kind of just pass that along to the team if you have any downtime. Normally we don't really provide these instructions to the associates to the customers, unless they ask for them, and then we just gather that information based on their needs and if it's available. So in programming and maintenance, these are your two most important functions when setting up a scale. We're going to start in maintenance mode, and then we'll move into programming. In maintenance mode, you have multiple features here that sometimes you will never go into, and that's okay. Like system info, it's just going to have the info of the scale itself in case the metal plate on the side gets ripped off. We'll have access to the information as long as it comes up on the screen. We'll have serial number, software information, things like that we can access inside the scale. Normally I haven't been in here but maybe 2 times because the damage to the scales are never that extensive that we lose that information on the physical side of it. You have things like data transmission viewer, info collect, scheduler, feature selection. These things aren't really accessed. I don't believe I've clicked on some of these before, just because this information is usually done and seen and known if it works or not at the scale level when you're updating pricing from RSM and things like that. Maintenance is another level to maintenance, to where you have scale, printer, database, scale IP, all these different options where you set the date and time. You can test the network to see if you are on the right scheme, and it'll tell you if you're communicating correctly, if you get a ping back from it. And of course, we're on a office network, so we are getting a live ping back from our router, so we know that we're on the network correctly. You can go into each of these and just navigate them yourself when on a scale, just to get comfortable with them. You have certain features that do not change because they're set up before they're shipped to us, like the operator brightness screen. You can change that. Customer brightness screen, you can change that, but they're at the optimal settings, so we don't mess with these particular settings. And if you don't understand a setting, where there are some that you normally don't change them or mess with them unless you've spoken with Digi, because they'll have more and clear information related to those individual settings. Some of these menu options have password protection, like Service Advanced, that will be listed in the description below for these individual passwords, but this one is 0953. I have a keyboard attached to the scale so that I can use numbers to type it in, or you can use the keypad down here. And it's going to access other information here. Things like the firewall, which is always turned off on the scale because it never really has internet communication. You have a US backup restore for the USB if you take a USB backup itself. This is where you can calibrate the touch screen. MAC address, which is always set up in the scale, you never have to change it. Printer maintenance, which I believe this may be the first time I am accessing it remotely, so I don't know what settings are going to necessarily be available here. I believe you can still go under sensor and do a calibration of the sensors. This is usually dealt with the liner labels and not the liner lists, because it uses gap peel and paper in. The liner list does not. The only other option that we normally deal with in this section is VNC password. This is how you would set the ability to use the type viewer, the type VNC viewer that we're using right now, to communicate to the scale remotely and do setting changes and data manipulation that you can access. You have to do this when you install the scale. That way you can set the password on the VNC viewer when you download it. You have different pages of data. A lot of these are used by Digi itself, and we eventually may use them, but we would always contact Digi before we use any of these. I have yet to use any of these settings in this section here, and in this page I have yet to use any of these sections here either. So we go back to the original maintenance mode. We can see that we have date and time, which allows us to set the, of course, date and time of the current scale, and we save it to update it. That is important for the pack date, so that when you are labeling a product where the pack date is required, it shows that it's today's date. Not necessarily the time. That's going to be a customer specific request. Outside of that, it's just about today's date. Hardware test, serial port configurator, weekly scheduler, these things aren't normally accessed, if at all. We usually deal with scale, printer, database, and scale IP. Scale IP is, of course, setting up the IP address of the scale onto the network if it's going to be communicating with a computer or program. Here in our office, we have it set up for 100, so it doesn't tie into any other device in the office. And of course, the basic gateway setup, and you hit save. Once you hit save, it'll set that it will set that IP address and setup, and you can come here to try to ping it off your computer if you're on the same network and verify that it's communicating. Normally you won't have to reboot the scale, but sometimes it is possible that you will, which is perfectly fine. once we finish with the scale IP, depending on if the scale has been used in the lab for testing purposes before being installed, we would use the database section to create a backup if necessary, or we use the init or init function to clear databases within the scale. Like the PLU, the main group, we can initialize these sections instead of going through and deleting them by hand. We can clear them all out at once. Say we're using a scale that has the same setup in the store, but it's a different department, and you've loaded in deli and you need to put in only bakery. You can come in and delete all of the PLUs and then have an empty PLU section and then load them in with RSM, or start having the operators put them in by hand depending on how they are taking care of that. We go back to menu, and now we go into printer. And printer, this is where we would have printer maintenance as we've seen before, and printer spec. Printer spec allows us to go into the printer 1 settings and allows us to change various different things that may be required to change when using a different type of scale or a different type of format that requires certain things to be done to get it to print the correct way the customer needs. These individual settings you would just become accustomed to and learn exactly what they do just by using the scale and getting comfortable with sort of just reading the straightforward information that comes off of each individual setting. And you can also search for keywords and things like that in each of these menus whenever you're in them, as long as a search function is available. We've been in printer maintenance mode. This is usually where we calibrate the printer sensors. And here we can do light calibration, of course, for peel and paper end. Sometimes the gap can be a little difficult and we have to do a deep calibration. Only do that when you've exhausted all the other ones multiple times and have done a couple resets of the scale to try to get it to a flat point before doing a deep one, because that can cause some headaches if it's done out of order. And then now in the last one we have scale for maintenance mode. This is where you would set your weights and measure specs, calibration. You really don't deal with these two unless you're dealing with Digi. So it's usually calibration and weights and measure spec. Inside weights and measure spec, we will have to turn on the span switch and press the PLU, which is located underneath the scale behind a metal plate. But from here, we're going to hit the X key so that we can just go into the settings and look at them in case we need to identify if one of the settings is what we want to change. So let's say we're looking for a tare change of information that's not in the user setup, which we will get to in the next video. We can go into here and change the way the tare functions to allow the customer to have easier access or unique changes to the way that their scale operates. And of course, we just look at the different settings and see exactly what they do to make the change or not, and if it's available to be changed in the way that they need. You have the weights and measures scale. This is where we would change the scale from 2-digit decimals to 3 digits in case the customer would prefer the 3 digits. If you change that, you don't have to change anything else on this screen, but you do need to change multi-interval range here to allow. And that'll allow when it gets beyond 15 pounds to switch back to 2 digits so that it doesn't have issues with weighing products up that high, because the thousandths place can become very difficult to weigh items, especially if there's a breeze or an air conditioning unit vent above the area. It can become more difficult with more weight added to the scale. With that, we went a little bit in depth on some of the settings, but navigating the maintenance mode is the important part of this video, where we deal in service advance, scale, printer, database, and scale IP primarily. You can use the menu buttons here to come back to the main menu screen, and we can begin the next video for the first layer of maintenance, and then the beginning of programming.